Shadows of DarkMoor. Chapter 1. The storm begins. Opening hook. The storm had raged for hours, drenching the cobbled streets of DarkMoor in torrents of rain that drummed relentlessly against the stone cottages. Thunder cracked through the air, sharp and ominous, while flashes of lightning revealed the desolate, shadow-drenched village under a bruised and turbulent sky. It was during one of these fleeting flashes of light that Eleanor, or Alaric, glimpsed a familiar figure lying still and lifeless at the edge of the village square. Setting the scene. As Eleanor drew closer, heart pounding and the chill of rain biting through her cloak, she realized it was indeed her spouse, crumpled on the ground as though felled by some unseen hand. The village square, usually bustling, was eerily quiet, emptied by the storm. The heavy downpour obscured her vision, but she couldn't tear her gaze from the pale, unmoving face in front of her. She knelt beside them, her hands trembling as she searched for a pulse, a breath, any sign of life. But there was nothing. Her spouse was gone, as cold as the rain-soaked cobblestones beneath them. The first inkling of suspicion. Her initial reaction was shock, followed by a sharp pang of grief that cut through the numbness. But as she sat there, drenched and stunned, another feeling crept in, a strange, gnawing sense that something was wrong. Her spouse had always been careful and had no reason to be outside at this hour. And why here, of all places? As lightning flashed once more, illuminating the square, Eleanor noticed something glinting in her spouse's hand, a small, tarnished trinket. She reached down and gently pried it from their fingers, finding that it was a charm of sorts, something unfamiliar to her. Her spouse was never one for superstitions, yet this charm bore markings she recognized from local folklore, symbols whispered about in DarkMoor's shadows. The ominous sense of dread deepened. Had they been involved in something dangerous, something she had no knowledge of? Or was this strange item a clue left behind, perhaps even planted by someone who wished them dead? Desperation and a call for help. A roll of thunder shattered the silence, and Eleanor forced herself to her feet, clutching the charm tightly. She stumbled through the square, back toward the village tavern, hoping to find someone who could help her. The storm grew fiercer, as if mocking her distress, rain slashing her face and soaking her clothes as she reached the tavern's heavy wooden door. Inside, the warm glow of candlelight spilled across the room. Villagers looked up in surprise as she burst in, her cloak dripping, her face a mask of grief and shock. "Please," she choked out, her voice barely rising above the roar of the storm. "Someone, my spouse." A murmur spread through the room, faces turning grim. A few rose immediately, but others held back, exchanging wary glances. No one in DarkMoor took kindly to unexpected events, and Eleanor could feel their guarded suspicion radiating toward her. Unease in the village. The tavern keeper, a burly man with a face lined by years of frowns, nodded solemnly. "Best get the healer," he muttered, and a few villagers slipped out into the night, heading for the healer's secluded cottage at the village's edge. As Eleanor took a shaky breath, the tavern keeper leaned closer. "Strange, isn't it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain pounding on the roof. "First the storm, now this. Always seemed your spouse was careful. One for routines." His gaze lingered on her, unreadable. Eleanor barely managed to nod, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She looked down at the trinket in her hand, her fingers tightening around it as a new realization took hold. This night was only beginning, and something told her that her spouse's death was merely the start of a far darker mystery. Chapter 2. DarkMoor awakens. The healer arrived quickly, her shadowed form emerging through the downpour like a wraith. Cloaked in layers to keep out the storm, she seemed more like an omen than a comforting presence. Behind her, a few villagers trailed in with their hoods drawn, casting furtive glances as they gathered in the square. Their faces were shrouded in shadow, flickering in the brief flashes of lightning, and Eleanor could feel their eyes on her. The healer's examination. As Eleanor watched, the healer knelt beside her spouse's body, placing one weathered hand over the still chest, her face set with the calm, dispassionate focus that villagers respected and feared. The healer muttered under her breath, fingers tracing strange symbols along the deceased's collar, as if seeking hidden wounds or marks. She glanced up, her eyes meeting Eleanor's with an intensity that made her shiver. "This is unexpected," the healer murmured, a slight tremor in her voice. Her gaze fell to the small charm still clutched in Eleanor's hand. "Where did you find that?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't trust anyone yet, least of all this healer, with her arcane symbols and guarded expressions. "In their hand," she replied finally, her own voice barely a whisper. The healer's eyes darkened as she examined the charm more closely. "This is an old piece, from a time when DarkMoor was more troubled." Her words hung in the air, making Eleanor's skin prickle with unease. Whispers among the villagers. The villagers shifted restlessly, exchanging glances as a hushed conversation began among them. Eleanor could only catch fragments. Words like curse, the old ways, and justice. The storm seemed to echo their words, each roll of thunder a reminder of the darkness that had settled over DarkMoor. Some villagers seemed fearful, others quietly defiant, but none looked her in the eye. Finally, the tavern keeper stepped forward, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Your spouse was a good soul," he said, his voice rumbling like the thunder. "But some folks don't forget certain things." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" His eyes flicked to the charm in her hand, then back to her face. "A charm like that was never meant for one like you, or your spouse. DarkMoor doesn't take kindly to those who meddle with the past." A hint of old secrets. Eleanor felt the weight of the villagers' silent stares. She knew there were tales in DarkMoor, stories of curses and ancient feuds, but she'd never believed them, chalking them up to superstition. Her spouse had dismissed them too, laughing off the village's old fears as nothing more than tales for the fireside. But now, in the storm-lashed darkness, with her spouse lying cold beside her, those stories didn't seem quite so ridiculous. She felt the charm dig into her palm, sharp and unsettling. What had her spouse been involved in, and why had they kept it a secret? The priest arrives. A figure emerged from the shadows of the square, carrying a dim lantern that cast a sickly glow over his face. It was Father Roland, DarkMoor's somber, unyielding priest. His sharp, hawk-like features and severe expression made him seem out of place at the scene of a tragedy, but his gaze softened as he looked at Eleanor. "My child," he murmured, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Take comfort in faith tonight. Your spouse's soul is at rest now, free from earthly suffering." Eleanor wanted to take comfort in his words, but something in his tone was off. She sensed that his presence here was more than a gesture of goodwill. His eyes kept darting to the charm in her hand, and his expression grew even more guarded when he caught her looking. "We must not dwell on things we cannot understand," he continued, his voice louder now, as if addressing the gathered villagers as much as her. "There are forces beyond our comprehension, sins that must be atoned for, sacrifices that may never fully heal." His words seemed weighted, as though they carried a double meaning, and Eleanor felt a chill creep down her spine. The priest's words hung heavily in the air, and as Eleanor looked around at the faces of her neighbors, she felt the unease deepen. It was as if a collective decision had been made to let her spouse's death remain a mystery, buried in the storm, along with any guilt or secrets that might have been involved. One villager in particular, an older woman with piercing eyes, muttered to herself as she shuffled back toward the tavern. Eleanor caught a few words. Always a consequence. Never should have meddled. It was becoming clear to her that the villagers knew more than they were letting on. They were hiding something tied to her spouse and the charm, perhaps even to the night's raging storm itself. The priest's cryptic words, the healer's strange familiarity with the charm, and the wary looks from the villagers left her feeling more isolated than ever. Chapter 3. Questions in the Rain. She couldn't trust any of them, not when they all seemed to be conspiring in some unspoken agreement. As the healer finally covered her spouse's body with a cloak, and the villagers began to disperse, Eleanor made a silent vow to herself. She would not rest until she discovered the truth, no matter how deep or dark the secrets of DarkMoor ran. As the storm thundered on, she made her way back to her cottage, slipping the charm into her pocket. She knew her spouse must have left some clues behind, hidden away in the small house they'd shared. Whatever the villagers were hiding, she was determined to uncover it before the night was over. Back in her cottage, Eleanor paced the small room, her footsteps muffled by the thick stone floors, the echoes swallowed by the constant drum of rain outside. Thunder rolled through the night, as if punctuating her thoughts, and a flickering candle cast eerie shadows that danced across the worn walls. Each shadow seemed to mirror the questions haunting her mind. Her spouse had hidden something from her, something that had drawn them to the square on this fateful, stormy night. The charm in her hand was proof enough of that. She had to find answers, even if the search revealed secrets she wasn't prepared to face. The search begins. She started with her spouse's desk, a modest oak piece tucked away in the corner of their shared living space. Usually, it was piled with simple notes on daily tasks and modest plans for the future. But tonight, the contents held an air of foreboding. Eleanor carefully went through each drawer, her fingers running over familiar objects with a newfound suspicion. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath some folded linens, her hand brushed against something unfamiliar. A piece of parchment, slightly crumpled and worn. She unfolded it with trembling fingers, eyes scanning the contents. A mysterious letter. The letter was written in her spouse's hand, the ink slightly smudged as though it had been hurriedly written, or perhaps handled many times. The words sent a chill through her as she read. To those who would seek answers in DarkMoor, beware the path you tread. There are forces that guard the past and exact a price on those who disturb it. The charm is a warning, a reminder that some doors are best left closed. The letter continued in cryptic, fragmented phrases, hinting at a hidden history of DarkMoor. There were mentions of a pact, a terrible sacrifice, and a list of names she didn't recognize. Her spouse's name was there, and beside it, someone else's, an ancestor's perhaps, or another villager whose story had long been forgotten. A hidden compartment. Eleanor's heart raced as she turned the letter over, wondering if there was more. Her fingers brushed along the inside of the drawer, and, to her surprise, found a slight indentation, a hidden compartment. She pressed it, and a small wooden panel clicked open. Inside lay a small, aged map of DarkMoor, its edges frayed and yellowed with time. Eleanor traced the familiar lines of the village, noticing that certain places had been marked in faded ink. The cemetery, the old mill near the river, and a lone, unmarked spot deep in the nearby woods. Her spouse had circled these locations, but why? What had they been searching for? A clue from the past. Beside the map was another curious item, a small, rusted key. It was ancient, the kind that hadn't been used in DarkMoor for generations. Eleanor couldn't imagine what it might unlock, but her mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it opened a crypt in the cemetery, or maybe an old, abandoned cellar somewhere in the village. Whatever it was, it felt important, like a piece of a puzzle her spouse had left behind. She took a deep breath, clutching the key tightly. DarkMoor had always been her home, but tonight, it felt like an entirely different place. A village cloaked in secrets, where every shadow held a hidden story, and every familiar corner was tinged with danger. Returning to the charm. Eleanor returned her gaze to the charm she'd taken from her spouse's hand. It was rough to the touch, bearing symbols that seemed more like ancient carvings than decorative etchings. She held it up to the light, and as she examined it, a memory surfaced. A story her spouse had once told her about a curse that supposedly haunted DarkMoor. In this tale, those who dared to disturb the past would face the wrath of the shadows, a darkness that consumed the curious and left no trace of them. Eleanor had laughed it off back then, dismissing it as another tale for cold nights by the fire. But now, holding the charm, she couldn't shake the feeling that her spouse had taken it seriously. Why would they have kept something so dangerous? Had they known they were in peril? Chapter 4. The Cemetery's Shadows. A startling revelation. Lost in thought, Eleanor was startled by a knock on her door. She quickly tucked the letter, map, and key into her cloak as she opened the door to find Father Roland standing in the rain, his face cast in shadows beneath his hood. "Forgive the hour, Eleanor," he said, stepping inside without invitation, his eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "I felt compelled to come to you. I sensed unrest." Eleanor stared at him, wondering how much he truly knew. She had never trusted the priest, his cryptic words always wrapped in layers of piety and judgment. Now, in the quiet of her cottage, she sensed something darker beneath his gaze. "Unrest?" she replied, her tone cautious. Father Roland nodded solemnly. "DarkMoor holds many secrets, Eleanor, and some spirits do not rest. It is better to leave certain matters in the past. I fear you may be tempted to seek answers where there are none." His gaze drifted to her cloak pocket, and Eleanor felt the weight of the charm and key hidden within. "I've already lost too much to leave questions unanswered," she replied, her voice firm. "If there are secrets, I'll find them." The priest's eyes narrowed, his mouth tightening as if he'd expected this response. "Remember, some truths come at a price. You may discover more than you bargained for." With that, he turned, his cloak swirling around him like a dark shadow as he left her cottage. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Eleanor alone in silence, the only sound the relentless hammer of rain against the window, determined to investigate further. Father Roland's ominous visit only strengthened her resolve. Whatever secrets he was keeping, she knew he wouldn't reveal them willingly. Her spouse had left clues, perhaps knowing that they were in danger. The map, the key, and the letter hinted at something buried deep within DarkMoor's past, something that had resurfaced with fatal consequences. As the storm raged on, Eleanor decided to visit the cemetery, one of the marked places on the map. She had no idea what she would find, but the weight of the charm in her pocket felt like a beacon pulling her forward. The cemetery loomed before her, shrouded in mist that clung to the ground like the lingering presence of the dead. Ancient headstones jutted out from the earth, worn and twisted by time, their inscriptions barely legible under the torrent of rain. Eleanor's heart hammered as she stepped into the graveyard, guided only by the faint light of her lantern and the map's cryptic markings. She shivered, clutching her cloak tightly around her shoulders as she searched the rows of graves. The storm had swallowed any other sound, and she felt utterly alone, with only the ghosts of DarkMoor's past to keep her company. Searching for a sign. The map in her hand was nearly unreadable in the rain, the ink blurring as the parchment grew damp. But she could still make out the faint outline of a cross marking one of the graves in the far corner of the cemetery. She pressed forward, her boots sinking into the mud with each step, as lightning occasionally illuminated the path ahead. When she finally reached the marked grave, Eleanor squinted at the worn inscription on the headstone. The name was faded, but she could make out enough to recognize it. Mira Blackwood, a name long whispered about in DarkMoor. A woman who had supposedly dabbled in forbidden practices centuries ago. Her death was said to be unnatural, a story wrapped in fear and legend. But Eleanor had always assumed it was simply another tale meant to keep the village children in line. Why would her spouse have marked Mira's grave on the map? What could a woman dead for hundreds of years have to do with her spouse's recent death? A strange encounter. As she pondered this, Eleanor's lantern flickered, and she felt an icy gust of wind sweep through the graveyard. She stiffened, senses heightened as she scanned her surroundings. A dark figure was moving between the tombstones, cloaked and hooded, barely visible in the shadows cast by the storm. Her breath caught, and she instinctively backed away, clutching the lantern closer to her chest. The figure seemed to move with purpose, weaving through the graves until it stopped at Mira's headstone, standing mere feet from her. "Who's there?" Eleanor called out, her voice strained yet defiant. The figure turned, and in the dim light, she could just make out a pair of intense eyes staring at her from beneath the hood. "You should not be here, Lady Eleanor," a low, gravelly voice replied. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Eleanor felt a rush of anger despite her fear. Who are you to decide what secrets I seek? My spouse is dead, and I demand to know why." The figure was silent for a moment, as if considering her words. Then, with an air of resignation, the figure reached into the folds of their cloak and produced something small and dark. It was another charm, identical to the one Eleanor had found in her spouse's hand. "Your spouse was warned," the figure said, holding the charm out to her. "They came here of their own will. No one forced them to stir the shadows of DarkMoor." With that, the figure turned and disappeared into the rain-soaked night, leaving Eleanor shaken, her mind racing with more questions than answers. A disturbing discovery. Eleanor stared down at the charm in her hand, rain streaming over her fingers. Her spouse had received a warning, but why? And from whom? She knelt before Mira Blackwood's grave, determined to uncover whatever it was her spouse had sought. She brushed away the damp earth around the headstone's base, feeling along the edges for anything out of place. Her fingers scraped against something solid, buried just below the surface. She dug carefully, unearthing a small metal box. It was heavily tarnished, almost blending in with the mud and grime. She pried it open, revealing a single piece of parchment inside, nearly destroyed by time and dampness. A pact in DarkMoor. The parchment contained only a few lines, written in elegant, faded script. Eleanor squinted, trying to make out the words. "By the shadows, we are bound. For DarkMoor's safety, we sacrifice, and we protect the secrets that guard us. Those who break the pact will meet the shadows in death." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. Her spouse had broken some ancient pact, an agreement that bound the village in secrecy. The charm in her spouse's hand, the warning, the map marking places in DarkMoor, all of it pointed to some forbidden knowledge they had stumbled upon. But had their death truly been an accident? Or had someone in DarkMoor ensured that the pact would not be broken? She pocketed the parchment and glanced around the cemetery, feeling eyes upon her even though she could see no one. Every grave now seemed to hold a secret, each stone marking a piece of the puzzle she was slowly piecing together. The priest returns. Just as she stood to leave, a familiar figure appeared in the mist. Father Roland, his face obscured beneath his hood. His eyes shone with something between worry and anger as he looked at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Lady Eleanor," he called out, his voice heavy with disapproval. "What are you doing here, disturbing the dead? I warned you to leave certain matters alone." Eleanor narrowed her eyes at him, clutching the parchment in her pocket. "And I told you that I would not rest until I had answers, Father. My spouse's death is connected to something dark, something everyone in DarkMoor seems content to ignore." Father Roland's gaze grew cold. "You're treading dangerous ground, Eleanor. Your spouse's curiosity was their undoing. Do not let it be yours as well." She held her ground, defiance simmering beneath her grief. "What are you hiding? What do you know about this pact?" Father Roland's face darkened, his jaw tight. "I know that those who pry into matters that don't concern them seldom find peace. The shadows of DarkMoor protect this village, and sometimes that protection demands a price." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving her once again in silence. Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine. The priest knew more than he was letting on, and the villagers were complicit in this pact, protecting secrets that spanned generations. A new resolve. As she walked back through the cemetery, Eleanor felt her sorrow solidify into determination. She would not be frightened off by vague threats and cryptic warnings. DarkMoor had taken her spouse, and if this pact was the reason, she would see it destroyed. The storm had not relented, and lightning cast brief, jagged glimpses of the village as she headed back toward her cottage. She knew that her investigation was far from over, and the night was still young. The stranger's warning, the charms and the words of the priest echoed in her mind as she mentally prepared her next move. Chapter 5. The Tavern's Secrets. Opening Hook. Rain poured in torrents as Eleanor reached the tavern, its heavy wooden door barely visible through the downpour. A flickering lantern by the door cast an unsteady glow, illuminating the faint outline of DarkMoor's crest carved into the stone above. She hesitated briefly, steeling herself before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The tavern was dimly lit and crowded. Villagers huddled together at small tables, murmuring in low voices as the storm battered the walls outside. The air was thick with smoke and dampness, and the tension was almost palpable. Every head turned as Eleanor entered, her soaked cloak dripping onto the floor. She could feel their eyes on her, a mix of pity, suspicion, and something darker. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. The tavern keeper's unease. The tavern keeper, a burly man named Oswin, with a long beard and a suspicious glare, looked up from behind the bar as Eleanor approached him. She had known Oswin all her life, but tonight, his usually warm expression was guarded, his eyes narrow. "Oswin," she began, keeping her voice low but firm, "I need to ask you something." Oswin glanced around, his expression tightening. "Lady Eleanor, now's not the time for questions," he muttered, casting a wary look at the villagers around them. "Grief has a way of clouding the mind. Perhaps it's best to leave well enough alone." Eleanor clenched her fists, feeling her anger flare. "I can't do that, Oswin. I know my spouse was connected to something dark, something the rest of you seem eager to keep hidden." Oswin shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward a group of villagers, watching them intently. "There are old traditions, Lady Eleanor. Things best left in the past, where they can't harm us. A rumor of the pact." Eleanor leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I found a letter," she said, watching his face closely for any reaction. "A letter about a pact, an agreement that has bound this village for generations. My spouse was trying to uncover its secrets, weren't they?" Oswin's face paled slightly, and he looked away, as though he had been caught. "They were curious," he replied, his tone reluctant. "Too curious for their own good. But they weren't the first to question the pact, and they won't be the last." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Who else, Oswin? Who else knew about this?" Before he could answer, an older woman seated nearby interrupted, her voice loud enough to catch everyone's attention. "Let it be, Eleanor," she said sharply. Her eyes were hard, her face lined with years of bitterness. "The pact has kept this village safe from ruin. Those who question it only bring trouble to themselves and to the rest of us." A murmur of agreement spread through the room, and Eleanor felt the weight of their collective gaze. The villagers were united in their silence, guarding their secrets with fierce loyalty. or perhaps out of fear. The tavern keeper's reluctant confession. Oswin sighed, his gaze softening with a trace of sympathy. Your spouse asked me about the pact too, he admitted quietly. They wanted to know why the old stories are still whispered in DarkMoor, why people believe the curse is real. Eleanor's brow furrowed. And what did you tell them? I told them what I know, that the pact was made to protect us, he replied. Centuries ago, Mira Blackwood, the woman whose grave lies at the edge of the cemetery, made a promise to DarkMoor. In exchange for our safety, she demanded loyalty. Every generation, a select few in the village, have kept that pact alive, watching over the signs and keeping the shadows at bay. He paused, looking down at his hands as if ashamed. Your spouse believed the pact was nothing but superstition, that it was a lie meant to control the village. They wanted to break the pact, thought it would free us from fear. Eleanor's heart sank as she absorbed his words. But you think it's real, she murmured, realization dawning. You think the pact truly does keep us safe. Oswin met her gaze, his eyes dark with fear. I don't just think it, Lady Eleanor. I know it. An ominous warning. The room fell silent as Oswin's words settled over the villagers. A sense of unease rippled through the crowd, and Eleanor could see the fear etched into each face. The pact was more than a story to these people. It was a shield against something dark, something they believed was waiting for them beyond the rain-soaked shadows of DarkMoor. Your spouse broke that shield, Eleanor, said the older woman who had spoken earlier, her voice trembling. They meddled in things they didn't understand, and the shadows claimed them for it. If you go any further, you may suffer the same fate. Eleanor felt a cold fury rise within her. My spouse did not die because of some curse, she replied, her voice sharp with defiance. They died because someone here wanted them dead, someone who knew too much about this so-called pact. A tense silence followed, and Eleanor sensed that she had crossed a line. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, as if a new and dangerous idea had taken root in their minds. Oswin shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between his loyalty to the village and his sympathy for Eleanor. The priest's interference. At that moment, the door to the tavern opened, and Father Roland stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. He cast a disapproving look at the assembled villagers, his gaze lingering on Eleanor with a steely resolve. Enough, he said, his voice low but powerful. This is not the time to be dredging up old stories and pointing fingers. The pact is not to be questioned, and neither are the forces that guard us. He walked toward Eleanor, his expression a mask of calm severity. Lady Eleanor, he said, his voice softening only slightly. You must let this go. I understand your grief, but disturbing these matters will only lead to more suffering. Eleanor met his gaze, refusing to back down. What exactly are you afraid of, Father? She challenged. That the truth will destroy this village, or that it will destroy the hold you and the others have on it? The priest's face darkened, his calm demeanor cracking for a brief instant. I am afraid of nothing, child, he replied, his voice low and icy. But you should be. The shadows of DarkMoor have claimed lives before, and they will again, if provoked. The threat was clear, but Eleanor refused to be cowed. She turned away from him, her mind racing with possibilities. If the pact truly had a supernatural power, she needed to see it for herself. And if it was a lie, she would expose it, no matter the consequences. A decision to push forward. Eleanor gathered her courage, stepping away from the priest and the accusing stares of the villagers. She knew she couldn't rely on any of them. They were too entrenched in their fear, too bound by their belief in the pact's power. But she was determined to find answers, even if it meant defying the very traditions that had ruled DarkMoor for centuries. Before she left, Oswin gave her a look of caution mixed with resignation. "If you go on, you'll be on your own," he said quietly. "No one will help you. We're all bound to DarkMoor's shadows, whether we like it or not." Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The villagers had made their choice, and now she would make hers. She would uncover the truth, no matter what dangers lay ahead. Chapter 6. Into the Shadows. Opening hook. The forest loomed before her, a wall of dark, twisted trees that seemed to reach out from the shadows. Lightning flashed, illuminating the skeletal branches for an instant before plunging everything back into darkness. Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself as she clutched the map and the tarnished key she'd found in the hidden drawer. The woods were unforgiving, even to those familiar with them. Tonight, they seemed almost alive, pulsing with an ancient energy that prickled her skin. Her cloak was soaked through, the rain seeping into her bones, but she ignored the chill, focusing on the task at hand. Somewhere in these woods lay a secret that DarkMoor had buried, one her spouse had been determined to uncover. Guided by the map. The map was faint, nearly illegible now from rain and wear, but Eleanor could still make out the circled location, a small clearing deep within the woods. Her spouse had marked it carefully, and as she followed the faint path winding through the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had walked this same path before, seeking the same answers. Her lantern barely pierced the gloom, casting eerie shadows that shifted with every gust of wind. She imagined whispers in the rain, strange rustlings beyond the reach of her light. The forest felt heavy with secrets, each twisted tree holding some forgotten memory of DarkMoor's haunted past. A sudden discovery. After what felt like hours, she reached the clearing, her heart pounding as she stepped into the open space. The wind seemed to quiet here, the rain falling more softly, as if she'd crossed into a different world. She could see an old, crumbling structure at the center, a stone altar, covered in moss and half buried in the earth. Its surface was etched with symbols, like those on the charm her spouse had held. As she approached the altar, Eleanor felt a strange, magnetic pull. She placed her hand on the cold, damp stone, running her fingers over the symbols. They were worn, ancient, but unmistakably tied to the lore of DarkMoor, the pact, the curse, the shadows that guarded the village. She reached into her cloak, pulling out the key, the charm, and the old parchment. The words on the parchment flashed through her mind. By the shadows, we are bound. The key seemed to fit into a small, hidden groove on the side of the altar. Heart racing, Eleanor inserted it, feeling a subtle click. She hesitated, bracing herself for whatever she might uncover, and then twisted the key. The altar's secret. A hollow sound echoed from within the stone, and a section of the altar slid aside, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in worn cloth, tied with fraying twine. Eleanor's fingers shook as she untied the cloth, revealing a set of pages, the ink faint and aged, but legible enough to read. The pages contained handwritten notes, accounts from villagers long dead, detailing their part in the pact. Her breath caught as she skimmed the lines. Each entry seemed to confess a dark act, a sin committed in the name of protecting DarkMoor. The villagers had sacrificed something, or perhaps someone, each generation, feeding the shadows that protected them. It was more than superstition. It was a ritual, a binding agreement that demanded payment. Eleanor's spouse had found this place, had seen these pages, and had chosen to break the silence. She understood now. Her spouse had wanted to free the village from this cycle of fear and sacrifice, to bring the truth to light. But someone, or something, had stopped them before they could. A sense of being watched. Just as she absorbed the grim significance of what she'd found, Eleanor sensed movement in the trees. She froze, her eyes scanning the darkness. At first, she saw nothing, only shadows and the occasional gust of rain through the branches. But then she heard a soft rustling, closer this time, like the tread of footsteps muffled by the mud. Her heart raced as she realized that she wasn't alone. She gripped the pages tightly, stuffing them into her cloak as she backed away from the altar, her gaze darting around the clearing. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound calm. A figure stepped into the edge of the clearing, half hidden by shadow. It was the same cloaked stranger she'd seen in the cemetery. Their face was obscured, but the intensity in their stance told her they knew exactly what she had discovered. "You should not have come here," the figure said, their voice a low, dangerous whisper. "The pact was made for a reason, Eleanor. Defying it will only bring ruin to DarkMoor." A confrontation. Eleanor took a steadying breath, defiance burning through her fear. "Ruin has already come to DarkMoor," she replied, her voice firm. "The pact has kept you all enslaved to superstition and fear. My spouse wanted to end that, wanted to free you, and now they're dead because of it." The stranger stepped closer, their face still shrouded. "Your spouse defied the shadows. They thought they could break the cycle, but the shadows do not forgive so easily. You are bound to DarkMoor, Eleanor, as are we all, and those who go against the pact pay the price." Eleanor felt a surge of anger. "Is that a threat? Are you telling me that the villagers killed my spouse to keep this cursed pact alive?" The stranger's silence was answer enough. They stood, an imposing figure wrapped in shadow, as if the darkness itself shielded them. Then, in a voice softened by something that almost resembled regret, the stranger spoke again. "DarkMoor has survived because of the pact, not in spite of it. The shadows demand loyalty, sacrifice. Your spouse broke that loyalty, and they paid dearly for it. If you continue, you may meet the same fate." A fateful decision. Eleanor's fingers clenched around the bundle of pages hidden in her cloak. "I would rather die than live in fear of shadows and curses," she replied, her voice steely. "The truth deserves to be known, even if it means breaking the pact." The figure hesitated, then lowered their head, as if resigned to her answer. "Then the shadows will find you," they murmured. "And when they do, you will have no one to blame but yourself." Without another word, the stranger melted back into the trees, their cloak vanishing into the storm-lashed darkness. Eleanor stood there, trembling but resolute, clutching the ancient confessions that would expose the truth about DarkMoor's pact. A return to DarkMoor. Eleanor took a final look at the altar, the ancient stone that had held the secrets of DarkMoor's past for centuries. She turned and made her way back through the forest, each step heavy with the knowledge she now carried. The rain fell harder, as if the storm itself was urging her to leave, to take her secrets and flee before the shadows reclaimed her. As she neared the edge of the woods, a thought gripped her, a realization that she could no longer trust anyone in the village. Not even Oswin, who had shown sympathy, nor Father Roland, who hid behind his sermons. She was alone in this, standing against an entire village bound by fear. But she would not back down. She would take these confessions and confront the villagers with the truth, exposing the pact that had held DarkMoor in darkness for far too long. Chapter 7. The Midnight Confrontation. Opening hook. As Eleanor stepped out of the woods and back onto the cobblestone streets of DarkMoor, the rain had slackened, but the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The wind howled through the village, rattling shutters and carrying whispers of secrets long buried. She clutched the bundle of pages tightly, her heart pounding as she made her way to the village square. The clock tower struck midnight, each toll echoing like a warning. Eleanor knew that what she was about to do would change DarkMoor forever. Whether for better or worse, she couldn't say, but her spouse's death would not go unanswered. Calling the villagers together. The few villagers still out on this stormy night noticed her immediately, and whispers rippled through the crowd. Some looked at her with pity, others with hostility, but all fell silent as she approached the center of the square. She raised her voice, loud enough to cut through the rain and thunder. "DarkMoor," she called, her voice steady and resolute. "I have uncovered the truth about the pact that binds this village. A pact of shadows, of secrecy, and of fear. A pact that has cost us far more than it's ever protected." At her words, villagers began to emerge from their homes, faces tense and drawn as they gathered around her. Oswin, the tavern keeper, stood near the back of the crowd, his expression one of resigned sorrow. Father Roland appeared from the shadows, his brow furrowed, his face pale and unreadable. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. "This is not the time for accusations. You are grieving. Your mind is clouded." But Eleanor ignored him, pulling the pages from her cloak and holding them up for all to see. "I found these hidden in the woods, buried in a place marked on a map that my spouse left behind," she announced. "They are the confessions of villagers who came before us, people who sacrificed others in the name of a so-called pact. They have lived in fear of the shadows, and they bound us all to that same fear, revealing the truth." A murmur of shock and disbelief spread through the crowd. Some villagers exchanged worried glances. Others frowned, reluctant to hear the truth she was revealing. Father Roland stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Those papers mean nothing, Eleanor," he said, his tone cold. "They are old stories, long dead. They hold no bearing on the present." "They hold every bearing on the present," she replied, anger flashing in her eyes. "This pact has taken lives, my spouse's life, and if we continue to live by its rules, it will continue to take lives." DarkMoor does not need shadows to protect it. This pact is nothing more than a tool to control us, to keep us in fear. Father Roland's face darkened, and he turned to the villagers. "Do not listen to her," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "The pact has kept DarkMoor safe for generations. Those who break it invite ruin upon themselves and the rest of us." Her spouse was a fool for meddling with things they didn't understand. Eleanor's blood boiled. "You think my spouse's death was just punishment for seeking the truth?" she demanded. "Are you all so bound by fear that you'd let this lie continue to rule you?" The villagers' divided reactions. A tense silence settled over the square as the villagers looked at one another, uncertain. Some muttered in agreement with Eleanor, expressions of doubt flickering across their faces. But others, particularly the older villagers, stood with Father Roland, unwilling to let go of the pact that had defined their lives. Finally, Oswin stepped forward, his face etched with sorrow and resolve. "Eleanor," he said softly, "we have lived with the pact because we believed it was our duty. But maybe you're right. Maybe it is time we stopped living in fear of shadows." His words caused a ripple of murmurs, and a few villagers nodded, emboldened by his statement. But the priest's face grew darker, his eyes narrowing with anger. "Silence!" Father Roland commanded, his voice cutting through the crowd. "This pact is not yours to break. It is not a matter of choice, but of survival. DarkMoor's protection is tied to the pact, and those who defy it risk everything." The priest's warning. Eleanor held her ground, defiance blazing in her gaze. "And how long will we sacrifice ourselves for this protection that we can't see, feel, or understand?" she demanded. "How many more lives will you let it take?" The priest's face twisted with fury, and his voice lowered to a menacing whisper. "If you reject the pact, Eleanor, you will bring down the wrath of the shadows. Your spouse was warned, just as you are warned now." The villagers looked on, torn between the priest's authority and Eleanor's bravery. In that moment, Eleanor realized that the pact was more than just tradition. It was a form of control, a way for the priest and those loyal to the pact to keep the village in line. And they were terrified of losing that control. A shocking confession. In the tense silence that followed, Eleanor took a risk. "Father Roland," she said, her voice loud and unyielding, "did you have something to do with my spouse's death? Did you kill them to keep the pact intact?" The villagers gasped, some stepping back in shock, others eyeing the priest with newfound suspicion. Father Roland's face twisted, but Eleanor could see the flicker of something close to guilt in his eyes. His voice wavered, just slightly. "They were warned," he replied. "They chose to ignore the warning." Eleanor felt a chill creep over her, understanding at last. Her spouse had been silenced not by some ancient curse, but by those who upheld the pact. She stared at Father Roland, the full horror of it dawning on her. He had orchestrated her spouse's death, using the pact as a pretext to eliminate those who threatened his power. "Do you see?" she cried, turning to the villagers. "This man, this pact, is a lie. It is nothing but a prison, meant to keep us silent and afraid. It's time we took our lives back from these shadows that have haunted us." The villagers' defiance. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, louder this time. Oswin and others took a step closer to Eleanor, showing their support. The older villagers hesitated, but she could see the doubt in their eyes, the cracks forming in their long-held beliefs. Father Roland's face contorted with rage, realizing that he was losing his grip on them. "You will all suffer for this defiance," he spat. "The pact will not be broken without consequence. The shadows will demand blood." But Eleanor met his gaze with steely resolve. "Then let them come," she replied. "We have lived in fear long enough." The priest glared at her, his final words dripping with venom. "You are a fool, Eleanor, and you will be the first to pay." With that, he turned and stormed away, his dark cloak billowing behind him as he disappeared into the storm. The aftermath. As the villagers dispersed, Eleanor remained in the square, Oswin and a few others standing by her side. She could feel the weight of their questions, their uncertainty, but also their gratitude. For the first time in years, they had challenged the pact, shaken free from its grip. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a tense silence over the village, as if even the storm had paused to watch what would happen next. Oswin placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grave but proud. "Whatever comes, Eleanor, you did what was right. DarkMoor owes you a great debt." Eleanor nodded, exhausted but resolute. The pact was broken, its grip shattered. But she knew the real battle was only just beginning. She had exposed the truth, but the shadows of DarkMoor would not vanish so easily. Chapter 8. The Consequences of Defiance. The storm had faded, leaving the night eerily silent, but Eleanor could feel a tension in the air, as thick as the rain-soaked earth beneath her. Shadows loomed over the village, casting elongated figures across the cobblestone streets and flickering through the cracks of her shuttered window. DarkMoor's secrets had been unearthed, and now it seemed the village itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor sat at her small wooden table, poring over the confessions she had uncovered, each page detailing the grim, twisted history of the pact. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly, and she peered cautiously through a narrow gap in her window. Groups of villagers, cloaked and murmuring, gathered in the square, whispering about the pact and her challenge to it. Some looked wary, others fearful, but all eyes turned toward her cottage as if expecting something ominous to unfold. An unexpected visitor. As she tried to make sense of the confessions, a knock sounded at her door, sharp and insistent. She tensed, heart pounding as she crossed the room, clutching the confession pages close. When she opened the door, she found Oswin standing there, his face grim and set in shadow. "Eleanor," he said quietly, stepping inside before she could invite him. "You've done a brave thing tonight, but there are many in the village who aren't ready to abandon the pact. I came to warn you. Father Roland and his followers are preparing to retaliate. They fear that by breaking the pact, you've cursed us all." Eleanor's jaw tightened. If they want to cling to lies, they're welcome to. But I won't let them drag this village down with their superstition. Oswin nodded, his gaze dark. "You'll need allies. There are others who support you, but they're scared. The pact has bound them in fear their entire lives, and fear isn't easy to shake. And Father Roland, he won't let this go. Eleanor swallowed, her anger mingling with a growing dread. Then we'll have to show them that the pact is nothing but a lie. If we can break his hold over the village, they might finally understand. A growing threat. As Oswin left, Eleanor felt the oppressive weight of the night bearing down on her. She knew Father Roland was planning something, and that he wouldn't stop until he'd restored the pact's power or eliminated her. The clock struck 1, the sound echoing through the silent village, and a creeping sense of dread wound through her chest. She tried to focus on the pages in front of her, but her thoughts kept turning back to the villagers still loyal to the pact. How far would they go to preserve it? And would they stop at nothing to silence her? Just then, she heard faint chanting drifting through her window. Curious, Eleanor peered outside and caught sight of a procession moving through the village, led by Father Roland. They were carrying lanterns, their shadows shifting and dancing as they headed toward the woods. Their voices rose in eerie harmony, a rhythmic chant she had never heard before, and the air grew thick with tension. Following the procession. Steeling herself, Eleanor grabbed her cloak and slipped out of her cottage, keeping to the shadows as she followed the procession. She clutched the confession pages tightly, determined to confront Father Roland and force him to face the truth he had so desperately tried to bury. The procession wound its way through the village and into the woods, lanterns casting flickering pools of light on the damp ground. Eleanor trailed behind, her footsteps muffled by the earth. The villagers' voices grew louder, their chanting echoing through the trees, each word carrying a weight that seemed to resonate in her very bones. The procession stopped at the stone altar she had found earlier that night, the one where her spouse had left her the final clues to uncovering DarkMoor's pact. Father Roland stood at the front, his face shrouded in shadow as he addressed the villagers. Father Roland's speech. "Tonight, our pact has been broken," Father Roland declared, his voice cold and commanding. "Our safety is at risk. The one who defied our ancient agreement stands before us, condemning us all to ruin. We must restore the pact or suffer the consequences." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, though some villagers looked uncertain, casting glances over their shoulders as if considering fleeing. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve unwavering. "The pact is nothing but lies," she shouted, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "These confessions tell the truth. DarkMoor has been held captive by fear, not protected by it. My spouse knew this, and now I know it too. The pact doesn't protect us. It enslaves us." The villagers turned to face her, shock and fear flickering across their faces. Father Roland's expression twisted with anger, his hands clenching into fists. "You foolish woman," he spat. "Your defiance has sealed your fate. There are forces at work here that you cannot comprehend." The villagers begin to doubt. Eleanor held up the confession pages, her voice ringing out with clarity. "These are the words of your ancestors, confessions that speak of needless sacrifices, acts of cruelty justified by a lie. My spouse saw the truth and paid with their life. But I will not be silenced." Several villagers shifted uncomfortably, casting uncertain glances between Eleanor and Father Roland. Oswin, standing near the edge of the crowd, nodded in support, and a few others followed his lead, rallying quietly behind Eleanor. Father Roland's eyes gleamed with fury. You would defy the shadows themselves, Eleanor? So be it. But remember this, you cannot change what has been bound by blood. The pact will reclaim what is owed. A supernatural unveiling. As his words echoed through the night, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing several lanterns. The temperature dropped, a biting cold settling over them, and a heavy mist began to roll in, cloaking the trees in an impenetrable fog. The villagers looked around in fear, clutching their cloaks as an eerie silence fell. Father Roland lifted his hands, his voice trembling with anger and something close to desperation. You see, he shouted, the shadows do not forgive. They are here. They have come to punish our defiance. Eleanor stood firm, though a chill crept up her spine. She had spent her life dismissing the tales of curses and shadows as mere superstition. But something in the air felt undeniably wrong, as if a force beyond her understanding had indeed been awakened. Eleanor's defiance. She took a steadying breath and stepped forward. No, she said, her voice strong. Whatever you see here tonight, it is not a curse. It is the fear you have nurtured, the terror you have fed. And now it has become something real, something that exists only because you have allowed it to. The mist swirled around her, and for a moment, she thought she saw shapes moving within it. Dark, spectral forms that seemed to pulse with life. But she refused to let fear sway her. She held up the confession pages, letting them catch the wind, and spoke to the villagers with unwavering conviction. This pact does not own us, she declared. We are free to choose our own fate. Let these words be a testament to those who suffered under this lie, and let them be a promise that we will no longer live in fear. Father Roland's downfall. Her words seemed to break a spell, and the villagers' fearful expressions began to change, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Father Roland saw his influence slipping, and desperation twisted his face. You will all suffer for this, he shouted, his voice breaking. The shadows will claim you, every last one of you. But as he spoke, the villagers closed in around him, their faces hard with resolve. They had heard Eleanor's words, and for the first time, they saw Father Roland for what he truly was, a man who had used their fear to control them. Oswin stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Enough, Roland. DarkMoor will no longer be bound by shadows. Realizing he was defeated, Father Roland shrank back, his power broken, his threats now empty echoes in the clearing. The pact is broken. As the mist began to fade, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The villagers murmured among themselves, casting wary but grateful glances in her direction. The pact had been broken, and with it, the hold that fear had kept on DarkMoor for generations. Oswin approached her, nodding solemnly. You did it, Eleanor. You freed us all. Eleanor managed a small, exhausted smile, though grief for her spouse still weighed heavily on her heart. We're free now, she replied, and maybe now we can begin to heal. Chapter 9. The Dawn. After the storm. The storm had finally lifted, leaving the village blanketed in a mist that clung to the cobblestones and softened the gray light of dawn. Eleanor stood in the square, her cloak still damp and heavy, her mind reeling from the events of the night. DarkMoor was different now. The pact was broken, and Father Roland's influence had been shattered. But as she looked around at the wary, uncertain faces of the villagers, she knew that freedom alone could not erase years of fear. Villagers murmured in hushed tones, still glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting the shadows to reclaim them at any moment. Some lingered near their homes, unwilling to leave the safety of familiar walls. Others eyed Eleanor with a mix of awe and trepidation, grateful for her bravery, yet fearful of the repercussions. An uneasy peace. Oswin approached her, his face etched with weariness, but softened by a quiet pride. "You've done what none of us ever dared, Eleanor," he said. "But it won't be easy for people to move on from what they've known all their lives. Fear doesn't vanish overnight." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "The pact may be gone, but the memories remain," she murmured. "They'll linger, even in the hearts of those who wanted to be free." As they spoke, the tavern keeper's wife approached, her face set in a frown. "Are you satisfied now, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You've torn apart our traditions, left us with nothing to protect us. What will you do when the shadows come back to punish us all?" Eleanor met her gaze, calm but resolute. "The only shadows that ever haunted this village were born from fear," she replied. "We created them ourselves, and they've ruled over us because we allowed it. But we're strong enough to move forward, strong enough to be free." The woman scoffed, muttering under her breath as she walked away. But Eleanor sensed that her doubts were less about the pact and more about the loss of the certainty it had provided. She knew there were many like her in the village, struggling to accept the sudden change, clinging to the old ways, even as they questioned their truth. A final letter from her spouse. As the day wore on, and villagers began to drift back to their routines, Eleanor returned to her cottage. The events of the night had left her drained, but she knew she couldn't rest, not while so many questions remained unanswered. She needed closure, a sense of finality to her spouse's death that the broken pact alone couldn't provide. In her cottage, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, folded piece of parchment wedged into the bottom drawer of her spouse's desk. Heart pounding, she carefully unfolded the page, her spouse's familiar handwriting sending a pang of grief through her chest. "My dearest Eleanor, I fear the truth I have uncovered may lead me into danger, but I can no longer ignore it. The pact binds this village in a way that strips us of our humanity, keeping us in fear of shadows and punishing those who defy it. I am not afraid of what the shadows might bring, for I know they are only as powerful as we believe them to be. But I am afraid for DarkMoor, afraid of the hold this lie has on our hearts. If you are reading this, it means I have failed to show the village what I know. Please, Eleanor, do not let my death be in vain. Show them that they can be free, that they can break these chains. Let them know that no shadows can own us. Not anymore. With all my love, your devoted partner." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes as she read the final lines. Her spouse had known the risks, yet they had been driven by a love not just for her, but for the entire village. They had seen the truth as a way to save DarkMoor from its own past, and they had paid the ultimate price. A conversation with Oswin. Later that evening, as twilight settled over DarkMoor, Eleanor met Oswin in the square. She showed him the letter, her spouse's words lingering in the quiet between them. "They were trying to save us all," Oswin said softly, his voice heavy with regret. "And none of us listened. We let the pact rule us, let Father Roland twist our fear into something far darker than any curse." Eleanor nodded. "The shadows were never real, Oswin. We gave them life, let them haunt us, because it was easier than facing the truth." She paused, gazing out over the village as the final traces of daylight disappeared. "But the village has a chance now. We can be free of this." Oswin hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than free us, Eleanor. You've given us a chance to rebuild, to remember what it's like to live without fear. DarkMoor will owe you a debt for as long as we stand." The village divided, but not everyone shared Oswin's sense of hope. As the days passed, Eleanor noticed that certain villagers remained aloof, casting her wary glances and whispering behind her back. Some still believed in the pact, in the shadows that supposedly watched over them. Without Father Roland's guidance, they had become leaderless, their faith shaken, but not entirely shattered. A small group of these villagers met in secret, seeking to reinstate the pact, clinging to the belief that only by honoring the past could they ensure the village's survival. Though few in number, they remained vocal, stirring up fear and suspicion wherever they went. One evening, Eleanor was confronted by one of them, a woman named Agatha, who had been a fervent supporter of Father Roland. "You may think you've won, Eleanor," she said, her eyes narrowed with barely contained anger. "But you've only invited ruin upon us all. You will see. DarkMoor's fate is sealed without the pact." Eleanor held her gaze, unflinching. "The only ruin that comes to DarkMoor will be of our own making. We're free now, Agatha. It's up to us to decide what we do with that freedom." A new beginning for DarkMoor. As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor witnessed a gradual transformation in DarkMoor. The village, once shrouded in shadows, began to embrace a cautious optimism. People moved more freely, smiled more openly, and gathered in the square without the tension that had once weighed on every interaction. The old stories began to fade, no longer whispered with reverence, but told as relics of the past. Children laughed and played in places they had once feared, and the villagers who had once been bound by secrecy found solace in the lightness of newfound freedom. Oswin and a few others started gathering at the tavern to plan for the future of DarkMoor. Together, they discussed ways to honor the past without being bound by it, to build a village that could stand without the weight of superstition pressing down on it. And though there were challenges, Eleanor saw the strength of a community willing to confront the truth and grow from it. Eleanor's final tribute. One evening, Eleanor returned to the clearing in the woods where the stone altar stood. She placed her spouse's letter on the weathered stone, whispering a quiet promise to honor their memory by ensuring that DarkMoor would never again fall under the spell of fear. She felt a peace she hadn't known in months as she walked back toward the village. Her spouse's legacy would live on in DarkMoor, not as a memory of sacrifice, but as a testament to courage and the willingness to face darkness with open eyes. As she entered the square, Oswin waved her over, a hint of a smile on his face. "We're talking about building a new meeting hall," he said, "a place where people can gather without fear, the thought you might want to help." Eleanor returned his smile, feeling the warmth of her community surround her. DarkMoor was changing, and though it would take time, she knew they would find their way. Chapter 10. A Forgotten History. Weeks had passed since the night Eleanor had broken the pact. Though DarkMoor was adjusting slowly, a newfound lightness had crept into the village. Smiles were seen more often, laughter drifted through the streets, and people walked without constantly glancing over their shoulders. Still, despite the peace, Eleanor sensed something lingering beneath the surface, unanswered questions that weighed on her like shadows. She felt her spouse's presence more acutely than ever, and a gentle restlessness nudged at her. Though she had uncovered much about DarkMoor's pact, she couldn't shake the feeling that a final piece of the puzzle lay hidden, waiting to be discovered. Perhaps it was a tribute to her spouse's memory, or perhaps a desire to bring true closure to DarkMoor. Either way, Eleanor knew she had one last journey to make. A rumor of an old journal. One afternoon, as Eleanor walked through the village, she was approached by an older man named Edwin, one of the oldest residents of DarkMoor and a former friend of her spouse's family. Edwin was often overlooked by the villagers, his quiet presence and wandering mind seeming to belong to another time entirely. But today, his eyes sparkled with a strange clarity. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice creaky but determined. "I knew your spouse well. They were good-hearted, a true soul of this village, and I know they left something behind, something you'll want to see." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Edwin's gaze softened, a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. "There's a journal. Your spouse asked me to keep it safe, told me it held secrets about the village's past, secrets that were older even than the pact itself. I don't know what's in it, but if you're still seeking the truth, you should take it." Without hesitation, Eleanor followed him to his cottage. Edwin disappeared into a back room and returned holding a small, leather-bound journal. It was worn and faded, but the pages were thick with writing, marked with symbols and drawings she'd never seen before. "Your spouse gave this to me before things turned dark," Edwin murmured. "They said it would help you understand. I don't know much else, but I'm certain they wanted you to have it." Discovering DarkMoor's origins. Back at her cottage, Eleanor lit a candle and settled at her desk, carefully opening the journal's pages. Her spouse's handwriting filled the first few pages, recounting stories of the pact and the altar in the woods. Much of it familiar from what she had already learned. But as she read on, the entries took on a darker, more secretive tone. One entry in particular caught her eye, dated just days before their death. "I've uncovered something much older than the pact, a truth hidden in plain sight. The founders of DarkMoor were not merely villagers seeking refuge. They brought with them a curse, a darkness born from a betrayal that stretches back to lands far beyond these woods. They bound that darkness here, in this village, with blood and fear. And we have kept it alive, generation after generation, without even realizing it." Eleanor's pulse quickened. The pact was only a part of DarkMoor's story, one chapter in a much longer, more sinister history. The next page contained a rough sketch of the village as it had looked centuries ago, before many of the buildings were constructed. In the center was a familiar mark, the stone altar in the woods. But there was something else, a symbol drawn beside it, one she hadn't seen before. The sketch showed the altar not as an isolated structure, but as the center of a larger design, with symbols and paths leading outward in a pattern that looked almost ritualistic. Beneath the sketch, her spouse had written a single line: "We were never alone." A chilling revelation. As she stared at the words, a chill crept over Eleanor. She flipped through the journal's final pages, reading hurried notes and fragmented observations that painted a picture of DarkMoor's founding more troubling than anything she'd imagined. Her spouse seemed to believe that the founders of DarkMoor had fled from something, a curse or a punishment, and had settled in these woods to escape it. But the darkness had followed them, and in a desperate attempt to control it, they'd created the pact. They had bound not just themselves, but all future generations, to ensure that the curse remained within the village, never able to spread beyond its borders. The pact, then, was not meant to protect DarkMoor from external threats. It was created to trap the darkness within, tethering it to the village with fear, secrecy, and blood. A journey to the old altar. A sense of urgency propelled Eleanor from her cottage. She didn't hesitate as she made her way through the village, past the curious stares of neighbors who'd grown accustomed to her nightly journeys. She returned to the forest, following the path to the altar she'd uncovered weeks before. But this time, she looked upon it with new understanding, seeing not a place of reverence, but a prison. As she reached the clearing, she opened her spouse's journal to the page with the altar sketch and traced her fingers over the intricate symbols, feeling a strange pulse of energy beneath her fingertips. The ground felt alive, humming with an ancient tension she hadn't noticed before. It was as though the land itself held its breath, waiting to see what she would do. In the journal, her spouse had written a note near the sketch. To end the shadows, the chains must be broken at their source. Eleanor set down the journal and examined the altar, searching for signs of the original bindings, anything that would hint at how the founders had trapped this darkness. Her gaze settled on a series of carvings around the base of the altar, symbols matching those in the journal. She realized that each one represented a family from DarkMoor, bound together in the pact, generation after generation, breaking the chains. Driven by a sense of duty to her spouse, Eleanor pulled a small chisel from her pocket and began to chip away at the symbols, breaking the bonds the founders had created. She worked quickly, but deliberately, each stroke feeling like a release, as though the ground itself was sighing with relief. When she struck the final symbol, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, and the mist lifted, revealing a sky filled with stars. The tension in the air dissipated, and a profound stillness settled over the forest. It was as if the shadows had finally lifted, freed from the prison the founders had constructed centuries before. A new dawn for DarkMoor. Eleanor returned to the village, feeling lighter than she had in months. The dawn broke over DarkMoor, its first rays illuminating the cobblestone streets and casting a warm glow over the village. As she walked through the square, she saw villagers emerging from their homes, rubbing sleep from their eyes and glancing around as if sensing the change. Oswin approached her, his face breaking into a smile as he took in her calm expression. "You've done something, haven't you?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. Eleanor nodded. "The pact is gone, Oswin, truly gone. The chains that bound this village have been broken." The villagers gathered in the square, a mix of awe and relief on their faces. For the first time, they spoke openly of the pact, of their fears, and of the shadows that had haunted them for generations. And though there were whispers of lingering superstition, Eleanor could see that a profound change had taken root. DarkMoor was free, not just from the pact, but from the darkness that had controlled them all. Eleanor's legacy. As the days passed, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. She spent time helping the village heal, sharing her spouse's journal with anyone who wished to read it, encouraging them to embrace their newfound freedom. Though some villagers still clung to their old beliefs, most began to move forward, letting go of the shadows that had once ruled them. Eleanor visited her spouse's resting place often, leaving flowers and quiet words of gratitude. She knew their courage had sparked this change, that it was their legacy that would live on in DarkMoor's freedom. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Eleanor looked out over DarkMoor, feeling the weight of her journey lift completely. She had not only honored her spouse's memory, but she had freed an entire village from a darkness that was never truly theirs to bear. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future, one of hope, light, and peace. Chapter 11. A Visitor with Secrets. The first warm days of spring had arrived in DarkMoor, and the village was blooming, transformed in a way that mirrored the hearts of its people. Children played openly in the square. The fields were alive with the season's colors, and even the woods, once dark and foreboding, seemed softer, gentler, as though the shadows had released their hold. Eleanor was in the midst of planting a small garden near her cottage when she saw a rider approaching from the north. Visitors were rare in DarkMoor, and for one to arrive now, so soon after the pact had been broken, stirred a strange feeling in her. She stood and watched as the rider, a middle-aged woman with a serious face and piercing eyes, guided her horse into the village square. The villagers glanced at one another, uncertain, but Eleanor stepped forward, sensing that this visitor had come with purpose. The visitor's tale. The woman dismounted and introduced herself as Lilith Draven, a historian from a neighboring town called Halliford. Her eyes flicked over the village with a curiosity that Eleanor recognized, a look that suggested she already knew more about DarkMoor than she let on. "I heard tales of strange happenings here," Lilith said, her voice low but clear. "Rumors of a pact broken, of a curse lifted. I came to see if there was any truth to it." Eleanor studied her, intrigued but wary. "There's truth in it," she replied cautiously. "DarkMoor was bound by a pact for generations, a pact we no longer serve." Lilith's eyes brightened with interest. "So, it's true," she murmured, more to herself than to Eleanor. "The Pact of Shadows. I've read about it in old records, but I never thought it was anything more than legend." At this, Eleanor's curiosity deepened. "You've read about the pact? What do you know of it?" Lilith glanced around, noticing the villagers gathering nearby, and nodded toward a quieter spot on the edge of the square. Eleanor led her there, And Lilith continued in a low voice. The Pact of Shadows is not unique to DarkMoor, Lilith explained. There are records of similar pacts across our region. Small villages, secluded hamlets, each with their own binding rituals meant to ward off a darkness that the founders believed followed them. It's as if your village is part of a larger story, one that has haunted many places for centuries. A troubling connection. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. The idea that other villages had lived under similar bonds, bound by the same fear, unsettled her. It meant that DarkMoor's story was not just theirs to bear. It was part of a much older, more widespread phenomenon. Are these pacts still in place in other villages? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lilith nodded grimly. In some places, yes, but there's more. The records I found mention a shared origin, a group of settlers who fled from a catastrophe long ago, spreading out across the land and bringing the same darkness with them. Each village was said to have established a pact to contain it, sacrificing freedom for survival. But no one knows exactly what this darkness was, or why it required such loyalty. Eleanor's mind raced. The idea that DarkMoor's pact was part of a network of pacts, each village bound by similar rituals and secrets, was overwhelming. If this was true, then breaking the pact in DarkMoor might have repercussions she hadn't anticipated. Eleanor's decision. That night, Eleanor invited Lilith to her cottage, where they pored over her spouse's journal, comparing the notes and sketches with the records Lilith had brought from Halliford. As they studied the symbols and patterns, Eleanor realized that her spouse's investigation had only scratched the surface. The pact wasn't just a binding ritual for one village. It was part of a complex, intertwined system that spanned regions. One entry in particular caught their attention. It was a rough map, similar to the one Eleanor had found, but this one showed symbols for other villages that had pacts of their own. Lines connected these villages like threads in a web, all centering on a single point, a place called Hallimoor. Lilith's eyes widened as she looked at the name. Hallimoor. I've seen that name only once, in a record dated centuries ago. It was described as the origin of the shadows, the place where the first pact was made. Eleanor's pulse quickened. If Hallimoor was indeed the source of the pact, then it might hold the answers she'd been searching for. DarkMoor's shadows had lifted, but for other villages still bound by their own pacts, Hallimoor might be the key to breaking free. A new mission. As the dawn broke over DarkMoor, Eleanor felt a new sense of purpose solidify within her. She couldn't ignore the possibility that other villages were suffering as DarkMoor had suffered, bound by fear and secrecy. And if she could find Hallimoor, if it even still existed, she might uncover the truth that had eluded generations. She shared her decision with Oswin, who listened intently, his expression somber but supportive. "You've already done so much for us, Eleanor," he said, pride in his voice. "But if there are others like us out there, others suffering under the weight of these pacts, then perhaps it's your calling to help them too." Eleanor nodded, touched by his faith in her. She knew the journey would be dangerous, that she would be stepping into a realm of unknowns far beyond anything she'd encountered. But she couldn't deny the call. DarkMoor was finally free, and now it was time to share that freedom with others, preparing for the journey. As she packed her belongings, Eleanor took one last look around her cottage, feeling a pang of sadness at leaving the place she'd fought so hard to save. But she knew that Oswin and the other villagers would protect DarkMoor's new future, ensuring that the pact would never return. Lilith agreed to accompany her, eager to document their journey and learn more about the origins of the pact. Together, they set out, their destination marked only by the faint symbols on an ancient map and the hope that they could uncover the truth behind Hallowmoor. A village united. The villagers gathered to see Eleanor off, their faces a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Oswin stepped forward, handing her a small token, her spouse's charm, now polished and shining. "To remember what you fought for," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And to remind you that DarkMoor stands with you, always." Eleanor accepted the charm, feeling its weight in her hand, a comforting reminder of the home she'd helped to free. She hugged Oswin, her heart full, and turned to the villagers, who cheered as she and Lilith set off down the path toward the unknown. Chapter 12. A Trail of Shadows. The path wound through dense, mist-laden woods, shadows stretching long and ominous in the early dawn light. Eleanor and Lilith rode in silence, the weight of their mission heavy on their minds. With each village they passed, each town they encountered, Eleanor noticed subtle but familiar signs. Half-whispered rumors, glances cast over shoulders, and ancient superstitions that seemed to echo the tales of DarkMoor. They had been traveling for days, following an old map in her spouse's journal that traced a winding route toward Hallowmoor. The journey had already taken them through villages that seemed almost frozen in time, places where the air felt thick with secrets, and the walls whispered of warnings from long ago. Lilith, an avid researcher, often stopped to gather local accounts, taking notes on each village's unique lore and history. Eleanor had grown accustomed to her companion's curious nature, her way of sifting through folklore and reality in search of clues. But as they moved deeper into these isolated lands, Eleanor felt a mounting sense of unease. She began to wonder if their search for Hallowmoor was not only dangerous, but perhaps destined to lead them towards something they were not meant to find. The village of Willowcroft. Their journey brought them to Willowcroft, a small, desolate village nestled in a fog-laden valley. As they approached, Eleanor noticed symbols etched onto the doors and windows of every home, protective sigils, much like those that had once marked the cottages of DarkMoor. She exchanged a glance with Lilith, who looked equally intrigued. "Another village bound by fear," Lilith murmured as they dismounted. "I wonder if their story is similar to DarkMoor's." They approached a villager, an elderly man with a lined face and cautious eyes. He eyed them warily, but agreed to speak with them in exchange for a few coins and the promise of discretion. "We live in peace here, as long as we obey," the man muttered, casting a quick glance toward the looming forest that bordered the village. "The pact was made generations ago. It's the only reason we've survived this long." Eleanor leaned closer. "A pact?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "What kind of pact?" The old man shrugged, as if reluctant to share. "No one speaks of it openly," he said, voice hushed. "But I've heard tell that it binds us to something dark, something that waits beyond the trees. The founders made the pact to keep it away." As they listened, Eleanor felt an eerie familiarity in his words. Each village they passed seemed bound by a similar pact, each one tied to a shadowed history they could not escape. A fading memory. That night, they stayed in a small inn on the edge of Willowcroft, where Lilith pored over her notes, connecting each village to a larger tapestry of legends and superstitions. "It's strange, Eleanor," she mused, looking up from her papers. "Every village we've passed through believes they're alone in this curse, as though each one is isolated by design. They have no knowledge of one another's pacts, yet each community shares the same fear. It's as if someone or something wants them kept apart." Eleanor thought of the map her spouse had sketched, the lines connecting each village to the others, each path leading to Hallamore. "It's as if we're being led there," she replied softly, her gaze distant. "As though this darkness has woven itself into the land, tying each village to the others, without them even realizing." Lilith nodded, her expression grim. "If we find Hallamore, it may be the only way to break the cycle for everyone." Eleanor shivered, feeling a strange compulsion to reach their destination, even if it meant confronting a force more powerful than she'd ever imagined. The strange markings in the woods. The next morning, they left Willowcroft and continued their journey toward Hallamore. But as they rode, they noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, symbols that matched the ones Eleanor had found in DarkMoor and seen on the doors of Willowcroft. The symbols seemed to lead them, each one marking a path deeper into the forest. The air grew colder as they rode, an unnatural chill settling over them, and Eleanor sensed they were being watched. The forest around them felt different from the ones she'd known, older, as though the trees themselves were alive with memory. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, and she felt an odd, prickling sensation, as though unseen eyes followed their every step. As they rounded a bend in the path, Lilith suddenly gasped, pulling her horse to a halt. Ahead of them stood a towering stone archway, half covered in moss and tangled vines, its surface carved with the same symbols that marked the trees. Beyond it, the path continued into darkness. "Hallamore," Lilith whispered, her voice barely audible. "We found it." The lost village of Hallamore. Eleanor's heart raced as they passed beneath the archway and entered the abandoned village. Hallamore lay silent and still, its buildings crumbling and overgrown, as though it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the silence was absolute, as if no living creature dared enter this place. They dismounted, leading their horses carefully through the desolate streets, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Every house was marked with protective symbols, and at the center of the village stood a stone altar, larger and more elaborate than any Eleanor had seen before. "This is where it began," Lilith murmured, awe-stricken as she studied the altar. The first pact, the place that bound all the others. Eleanor approached the altar, her hands brushing over the symbols carved into its surface. She could feel an energy radiating from it, a dark, pulsing force that seemed to call out to her, as though the village itself held some remnant of the darkness it had tried to contain. The journal of the founder. As they explored, They found an ancient building that looked like it had once served as a temple or council hall. Inside, they discovered a dusty, forgotten chest. Eleanor knelt and carefully pried it open, revealing a set of old books and scrolls, each one meticulously preserved despite the decay around them. Lilith took one of the books, a heavy leather-bound volume, and began to read aloud. We came to these woods in desperation, fleeing the ruin we had brought upon ourselves. The darkness followed, unyielding, relentless. We could not escape it, so we did the only thing we could. We bound it to us, contained it within a pact that would last for as long as we remained loyal. We swore to keep the shadows at bay, to pass the burden down through the generations. And so the pact was made, an unbreakable chain to preserve our survival, knowing that if we faltered, the darkness would rise again. Eleanor felt a chill as the words sank in. The founders had not simply fled a curse. They had brought it with them, tethered it to themselves, and to every village that followed. Hallamore was not just the origin of the pact. It was the prison that held the darkness bound. They didn't just bind it to DarkMoor, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. They bound it to themselves, to each generation that followed. It's a curse that has spread from village to village, passed down like an infection. And it will only be broken if... Lilith finished her thought. If the original pact is destroyed, a reckoning at the altar. Together, they returned to the altar at the center of Hallamore. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of countless lives, of generations who had suffered under the pact's curse. She pulled out a small chisel and began chipping away at the symbols on the altar, just as she had done in DarkMoor. Each strike of her chisel seemed to resonate through the air, as if the very foundations of the pact were beginning to crack. As she chipped away the final symbol, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the village. The air felt charged, alive with energy, and Eleanor braced herself, feeling as though the ground might give way beneath her feet. With one last swing, the symbol broke, and a sudden rush of wind swept through the village, scattering leaves and dust as the oppressive energy dissipated, leaving only silence in its wake. A new dawn for the pacted villages. Eleanor and Lilith stood together, feeling the weight lift from Hallamore. The pact was finally broken, the darkness released, its bonds shattered. They knew that across the region, villages bound by the same pacts would feel the change, that those still haunted by shadows would finally be free. As they left Hallamore, Eleanor felt a profound sense of closure, a peace she had not known since her spouse's death. DarkMoor was free, and now so was she. She had fulfilled the promise she had made to her spouse, and she knew they would be at peace, knowing that the shadows were gone, that no other village would live in fear of a pact that should never have existed. Chapter 13. Return to DarkMoor. The journey back to DarkMoor was different from the one Eleanor and Lilith had taken to Hallamore. This time, the shadows felt lighter. The weight of fear finally lifted. As they approached the village, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar peace settle within her, a calm she hadn't known since her spouse's death. She had faced the darkness, shattered its hold, and liberated countless villages from a centuries-old curse. When they arrived in DarkMoor, villagers gathered in the square, greeting Eleanor with awe and gratitude. Word had spread quickly of her journey to Hallamore, and she was welcomed back as a savior, a figure of courage who had dared to challenge a force that had ruled over them for generations. As Oswin approached her, his face split in a wide smile. Eleanor felt a deep warmth in her heart. "You've done it, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We're free, truly free. You have given DarkMoor a future." Eleanor smiled back, feeling a sense of closure and relief. The pact was gone, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what life might be like beyond the shadows. Celebration and healing. That night, the village gathered in the tavern to celebrate. Laughter and music filled the air, and the rooms were packed with people eager to share their gratitude with Eleanor. She spoke with villagers who had once been bound by fear, and as she listened to their stories, she felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the work her spouse had begun was now complete. Lilith, always one for stories, regaled the crowd with tales of their journey to Hallamore, her voice animated as she described the abandoned village and the altar that had held the darkness captive. The villagers hung on her every word, marveling at the bravery it had taken to confront such ancient mysteries. As the night wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of the past finally lift from her shoulders. She had kept her promise to her spouse, fulfilled her duty to DarkMoor, and ensured that no one else would suffer under the shadow of the pact. The village was safe, and her work was done. Or so she thought. A strange artifact. As the crowd began to disperse, one of the elders, a woman named Thalia, approached Eleanor, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Her expression was solemn, her eyes thoughtful as she held the bundle out to Eleanor. "I wanted to give you this," Thalia said, her voice soft but steady. "I found it years ago, buried near the edge of the woods, near the same altar where we made our offerings. I never understood what it was, but I think it's meant for you." Eleanor unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small stone amulet. It was engraved with a symbol she hadn't seen before, a spiral that seemed to twist inward, drawing her gaze. The stone had an unusual sheen, almost iridescent, and as she held it, she felt a strange warmth radiate from it. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, frowning as she turned the amulet over in her hands. Thalia shook her head. "I don't know, but it always seemed ancient, older than the pact, even older than the stories we know. I think it has something to do with the land itself, something that goes beyond the pact. My grandmother once said it was a relic of the first people, but she never explained." Eleanor's curiosity stirred. She thought back to Hallamore, to the strange feeling she'd had in the woods, as though the land itself held secrets she hadn't yet uncovered. A new mystery unfolds. The next day, Eleanor met with Lilith to discuss the amulet. Lilith examined it closely, her eyes alight with excitement. "This symbol," she murmured, tracing the spiral with her finger. "I've seen it mentioned in only the oldest records, in accounts that speak of something called the Source." "The Source," Eleanor repeated, feeling a familiar thrill of discovery. "What does that mean?" Lilith's expression turned thoughtful. "The Source is described as the origin of the shadows, a place where the world was said to split between light and dark. It was believed to be a physical location, a place of power. Some stories say that those who reached it could commune with the land itself, unlocking secrets that were thought lost to time. Eleanor felt a shiver run through her. Could that be the real source of the pacts? Not just Hallowmoor, but something even older? Lilith nodded slowly. Perhaps. The pacts could be remnants of something far more ancient. Rituals meant to contain powers that once flowed freely through the land. If that's true, then the pact's darkness may only be a fragment of a much larger story, one that we've only begun to understand. Visions of the past. That night, as Eleanor held the amulet and reflected on Lilith's words, she felt an odd sensation, an almost magnetic pull toward the woods. She slipped outside, clutching the amulet tightly, and made her way to the edge of the village, where the trees stood tall and silent in the moonlight. As she stepped into the forest, she felt the world around her shift, as though she were entering a place beyond time. Shadows danced among the trees, but this time they felt different. Not ominous, but ancient, wise, as though they held memories of things long forgotten. Eleanor closed her eyes, clutching the amulet tightly, and an image flashed in her mind. A vast, open field bathed in twilight, where figures cloaked in white stood in a circle. Hands joined as they chanted. At the center of the circle was a single stone, carved with the same spiral symbol on her amulet. She felt a voice, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, whisper in her mind. The source awaits those who seek. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the forest, the vision fading, but the weight of its message remained. The path to the source. Eleanor returned to the village at dawn, where she shared her experience with Lilith, who listened with rapt attention. Together, they studied the amulet and discussed what the vision might mean. The source may be more than a place, Lilith speculated. It could be a way of understanding, a connection to the land, a way to unlock its mysteries. Eleanor nodded, a sense of resolve filling her. Whatever it is, I believe it's calling to us. If this source is the origin of the shadows, then it's something we need to understand. DarkMoor may be free from the pact, but if there's a greater force at work, we need to uncover it before it surfaces again. Oswin, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward, his face solemn. "If you go, Eleanor, you'll have our support," he said. "You've done so much for DarkMoor, but we would never ask you to take on more than you already have." Eleanor smiled softly. "Thank you, Oswin. But this is something I have to do, not just for DarkMoor, but for all those who might still be affected by whatever lies beyond the pact. I can't ignore the call." A final farewell. With the villagers' blessings and Lilith by her side, Eleanor prepared for yet another journey. As she left DarkMoor, she looked back at the village one last time, feeling both sadness and hope. This new mystery felt different from the pact. It was as though she were being drawn towards something unknown, yet deeply familiar. The journey to the source would be unlike any she had taken before. A quest to confront not just the darkness that had haunted DarkMoor, but the primal forces that had shaped the world itself. And though she knew the road ahead would be perilous, she felt ready. As the village faded from view, she tightened her grip on the amulet, feeling its warmth seep into her hand. The spiral etched into its surface seemed to glow faintly, as though urging her forward. Chapter 14. The Journey to the Source. Eleanor and Lilith moved through forests untouched by time, where the trees towered like sentinels and the air felt thick with memory. Each step into the ancient woods felt like a step into another world, one that breathed with secrets and shadows. The amulet Eleanor carried grew warm against her chest, pulsing with a faint energy that seemed to guide them, urging them deeper into the unknown. The journey had been long and arduous, and with each day, the landscapes grew stranger. Forgotten temples and ancient markings lined their path, remnants of a people who had once communed with the land in ways no one in DarkMoor could comprehend. Lilith paused to study a crumbling stone marked with spirals and symbols, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These symbols," she murmured, tracing them with her fingers. "They all point toward one place. It's as though this entire region was designed to lead people to the source." Eleanor felt a shiver run through her. "As if it was calling to them," she said softly, feeling the pull of the amulet grow stronger with each step they took. A lost temple. As they ventured further, they came upon the ruins of a vast temple, hidden beneath a canopy of trees and nearly swallowed by thick vines. The structure was ancient, its stone walls etched with carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light filtering through the trees. Lilith knelt by one of the walls, her eyes widening as she examined a series of carvings that depicted a group of robed figures standing in a circle, their hands raised in invocation around a large stone, marked with the same spiral symbol that adorned Eleanor's amulet. "This must have been a place of worship," Lilith whispered, awe in her voice. The people who lived here believed the source was a living presence, something they could commune with. Eleanor felt an intense energy radiating from the stones, as though the temple itself still pulsed with the echoes of ancient rituals. She reached out, her hand brushing against the stone, and in that moment, a vision flooded her mind. A vision of the source. She saw a gathering of people, dressed in robes, their faces solemn as they chanted in unison around the spiral-marked stone. The air hummed with power, and in the center of their circle, a dark energy rose, swirling and twisting like a living shadow. The figures raised their hands, guiding the energy, shaping it, binding it to the land. The vision shifted, and Eleanor saw glimpses of villages scattered across the region, villages that bore the same symbols, that held the same secrets in their silence. Each one was bound to the source, each one tied by an unbreakable thread of loyalty and fear. The vision faded, leaving Eleanor breathless. She looked at Lilith, who was watching her with concern. "What did you see?" Lilith asked. "The source," Eleanor whispered. "It's not just a place, it's a force, something they summoned and bound. The founders of these villages, they weren't just protecting themselves from the shadows. They were containing something powerful. The warnings of the past." They continued deeper into the temple, where they found a set of stone tablets arranged in a small alcove. The tablets were etched with ancient writings, and Lilith carefully translated as best as she could, her voice soft and reverent. To seek the source is to seek the balance between light and shadow. We are bound to it, for it is the thread that weaves the world. But beware, the source is neither good nor evil. It is power, pure and untempered, and those who reach it, unprepared, risk being consumed by it. Eleanor felt the weight of the warning settle over her. "It sounds as if the source is a gateway," she murmured. "A way to commune with something beyond our understanding." Lilith nodded slowly. "Or perhaps it's a test, a force that allows those who are worthy to wield its power, but only if they understand the balance it represents." The words filled Eleanor with a mix of awe and apprehension. She realized that if they continued, they would be risking more than just their lives. The source might demand something from them, something they could not take back. The final leg of the journey. Despite the risks, Eleanor and Lilith pressed forward, following the amulet's gentle pulse. They journeyed through winding trails and overgrown paths, passing relics of forgotten civilizations that had once sought the source. Their stories lost to time. The landscape grew increasingly surreal, with twisted trees and stones that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Finally, after days of travel, they reached the edge of a vast clearing. At its center was a stone platform, carved with intricate spirals and markings that radiated outward like spokes of a wheel. At the heart of the platform was a single, massive stone, the source, pulsing faintly with an otherworldly glow. Eleanor and Lilith approached, their footsteps slow and reverent. As they neared the stone, Eleanor felt a powerful energy course through her, a sensation that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She sensed that the source was alive, a conscious presence that seemed to be waiting, watching. The challenge of the source. As she reached out to touch the stone, a voice echoed in her mind, deep and resonant. "Do you seek balance, or do you seek power?" Eleanor hesitated, feeling the weight of the question press down on her. She knew that the pact had been a way of containing the power of the source, a way of binding it to human will. But now she understood that it was not meant to be controlled. It was a force of nature, a primal energy that demanded respect. "I seek balance," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "The villages have suffered under fear and shadows because we tried to control what was never ours to bind. I seek only to bring peace, to let the source remain free, so that it can guide us without our interference." The energy around her seemed to shift, and she sensed the source probing her intentions, testing the truth of her words. She glanced at Lilith, who nodded in silent support, her own expression solemn. A final revelation. The source responded with a flood of images, showing Eleanor a vision of what could be. A world where the villages lived without fear, where the land itself held wisdom that could be shared, not contained. She saw DarkMoor and the other villages thriving, connected not by fear, but by understanding, each place a part of a greater whole. And then the vision faded, and she felt a warmth settle over her, a reassurance that the balance she sought was possible. But with that reassurance came a warning. The source was a force of duality, of both light and shadow, and it would never be fully tamed. She understood that while the villages were free from the pact, they would always carry the potential for both creation and destruction. The source was not a power to wield, but a presence to respect, one that demanded humility. Returning to DarkMoor. As Eleanor and Lilith turned away from the source, they felt a deep peace settle over them, a sense of closure. had sought answers, and they had found not only the truth of the source, but the wisdom to leave it undisturbed. When they returned to DarkMoor, the villagers welcomed them with open arms. Eleanor shared her story, explaining that the Pact's darkness was no longer a threat, that the land itself was free, and that the source would remain as a reminder of the balance that must be respected. The village celebrated their return, embracing the freedom they had longed for. But Eleanor knew that they would not forget the lessons learned, that the memory of the source would remain as a reminder of the power that lay within the land, a force that could only be honored, never controlled. Embracing a new future. In the days that followed, Eleanor felt herself at peace for the first time in years. The darkness that had haunted her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength that came from understanding. She had uncovered the truth of the pact, of the source, and of the balance that lay between light and shadow. With DarkMoor now free, she felt ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. And as she looked out over the village, she knew that her journey had given her a gift beyond words, a connection to the land, to her people, and to the mysteries that lay within the world itself. She would carry that gift with her always, a quiet reminder of the courage it had taken to confront the shadows, and the wisdom it had taken to leave them in peace. Epilogue. A new calling. The morning light filtered softly through Eleanor's cottage, illuminating the symbols and notes she had gathered over her journey. She sat quietly by the window, gazing out over DarkMoor as villagers went about their morning tasks. The shadows of the past, now only faint memories. The village was at peace, and so, finally, was Eleanor. She thought of her spouse, of the sacrifices that had brought DarkMoor to this point, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had done what she set out to do, honoring their memory and freeing her home from fear. Her life now was simpler. She tended to her small garden, shared stories with Oswin and Lilith, and felt the steady rhythm of village life around her. Yet, even as she settled into this newfound calm, Eleanor sensed a part of her that remained attuned to the mysteries of the land. Her journey had transformed her, connecting her to a vast and ancient network of wisdom and secrets. And though she felt no compulsion to seek out further mysteries, she knew that her path had only begun. The arrival of a letter. One afternoon, a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find a messenger, a young woman with an air of urgency, holding a sealed letter. "This came for you, Lady Eleanor," the messenger said, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and respect. It traveled far, from the scholars at the university in the capital. Eleanor's curiosity piqued. She thanked the messenger and closed the door, breaking the seal on the letter and reading its contents. The letter was from a scholar named Eamon Ardent, who introduced himself as a historian specializing in ancient civilizations. He had heard of her journey to Hallamore and her efforts to break DarkMoor's pact, and was captivated by the legends she had uncovered. His letter was filled with admiration for her courage, and with details of a mystery that he believed only someone like her could solve. "Lady Eleanor," the letter read, "I seek your expertise, your courage, and your wisdom. The source you uncovered is but one piece of a far larger tapestry. I have found fragments of records that speak of a hidden order, an ancient society dedicated to preserving the balance between light and shadow. Their influence extends far beyond our land, and I believe they were guardians of a power even older than the pacts. If you are willing, I invite you to the capital to help us decipher these records, to unravel a mystery that could change our understanding of our world and its history. The journey may be dangerous, but I believe you are the only one who can unlock its secrets. Eleanor set the letter down, her heart racing. The life of quiet peace she had imagined for herself was suddenly filled with new possibilities. The idea of a hidden order, of guardians who had once protected the balance she had fought to preserve, stirred something within her. A yearning for knowledge, for purpose beyond her village. A conversation with Oswin and Lilith. That evening, Eleanor shared the letter with Oswin and Lilith, who listened with rapt attention. Lilith's eyes sparkled with excitement as she read Eamon's words, her mind already racing with the possibilities of what they might uncover. "This is extraordinary," Lilith exclaimed. "If what he says is true, then the source may be just one part of a greater truth. Imagine a society dedicated to the preservation of balance, stretching back centuries, perhaps even millennia." Oswin, though visibly impressed, looked at Eleanor with a mixture of concern and respect. "You've done so much already, Eleanor. DarkMoor owes you more than we can ever repay. Are you sure you want to take this on?" Eleanor felt a calm certainty settle over her. "I've done my duty to DarkMoor," she replied. "But this feels like something I was meant to do. I felt the presence of the source, seen glimpses of something larger. I need to understand it." Lilith grinned, clearly hoping to join her friend on this new adventure. "Then we go together, just as we did before." Eleanor smiled, deeply grateful for Lilith's unwavering friendship. Then it settled. "We'll go to the capital, meet this scholar, and see what mysteries await." A new journey begins. The next morning, Eleanor prepared for the journey, packing only what she needed, including the amulet from Hallowmoor and her spouse's journal, both constant reminders of the journey that had shaped her. She said her farewells to the villagers, who wished her well with heartfelt words of gratitude and pride. Oswin clasped her hand warmly, promising that DarkMoor would be waiting for her when she returned. As she and Lilith set off, Eleanor felt a familiar thrill, a sense of stepping into the unknown, of embracing a destiny that had waited for her all along. The road to the capital was long, but with each step, she felt her purpose deepen, her bond with the land and its mysteries grow stronger. In the distance, the capital city rose like a beacon, its walls gleaming in the morning sun, and Eleanor knew that a new chapter in her life was about to unfold. A final reflection. As they traveled, Eleanor thought of her spouse, of the vision they had shared to free DarkMoor and break the chains of fear. She knew that her journey had been not just a battle against shadows, but a journey toward understanding the delicate balance that held the world together. She was no longer just a villager from DarkMoor. She was a seeker, a guardian of the balance between light and dark. Her journey had transformed her, and as she approached the capital, she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The mysteries she had uncovered were only the beginning. And with Lilith by her side and a heart open to discovery, Eleanor knew that her life, her purpose, and her understanding of the world would only continue to deepen. The land awaited her, its secrets as ancient as time itself, and she was ready to listen.